A racist police officer points his gun at a black woman, completely unaware that she is the director of the FBI. How does a moment like this even happen? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where power was abused in front of you or seen someone else suffer from such blatant injustice? This story isn't just about one shocking incident. It's a wake-up call to the deeper issues that plague our society. Watch how this extraordinary woman turned fear and confrontation into a powerful push for change. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Lisa Carter, director of the FBI, gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black SUV as it glided smoothly down a dimly lit suburban road. The stillness of the night offered a rare reprieve from the day's unrelenting pressures. At 40, Lisa had navigated one of the most demanding positions in federal law enforcement, with an air of quiet authority, earning respect in a field that often tried to push her to the margins. Tonight, though, she wasn't a public figure or a symbol of progress. She was just a woman heading home, longing for a quiet evening. The road ahead was empty, her headlights cutting through the darkness. A few scattered houses stood silent, their windows dark, with the occasional porch light flickering in the distance. The hum of the tires and the steady rhythm of her breathing were the only sounds accompanying her. She checked the clock on the dashboard. It was just after 10 p.m. The tranquility was shattered by the sharp flash of red and blue lights reflecting in her rearview mirror. The unmistakable sound of a siren followed, piercing the stillness and jolting Lisa from her thoughts. Her brow furrowed. She was certain she hadn't been speeding. The needle on her speedometer had hovered well below the limit. Her turn signals had been used correctly, and the road signs were unmistakable. There was no conceivable reason for her to be pulled over. Yet, the command was clear. With a calm she had cultivated over decades of high-stakes situations, Lisa flipped on her blinker and guided her car to the side of the road. The SUV came to a gentle stop under a faint streetlight, the glow spilling across the hood. Lisa reached for her glove compartment, ensuring her registration and insurance were in easy reach. Her driver's license sat ready in her wallet. There was no need to panic. This was a routine stop, or so she told herself. But an undercurrent of unease crept in. Something about the abruptness of the situation felt off, and her instincts, honed through years of experience, warned her to remain vigilant. The officer approached her window. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with a deliberate stride that spoke more of authority than professionalism. As he neared, his uniform came into full view, pristine, almost exaggeratedly neat, with a badge that glinted in the artificial light. His face was set in a hard line, his jaw tight, and his eyes carried an edge that made Lisa's grip on the steering wheel tighten slightly. Rolling down her window, she offered a polite but reserved, "Good evening, officer." He didn't return the greeting. Instead, his voice was curt and clipped. "License and registration." Lisa nodded, handing over the documents she had prepared. "Here you go," she replied evenly. The officer took the papers without a word, his gaze lingering on her longer than necessary before glancing at the SUV's interior. "Step out of the vehicle," he said abruptly. Lisa blinked, taken aback by the command. "I'm sorry, could you clarify why I'm being stopped?" "You were pulled over for security reasons," he replied, his tone sharp, offering no further explanation. Lisa felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "I don't believe I've violated any traffic laws. My license and registration are valid. Is there something specific you're concerned about?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Step out of the car," he repeated, his voice carrying an undercurrent of impatience. Lisa took a measured breath, the calm professionalism that had guided her through countless interrogations now keeping her steady. "Officer, I'd like to comply, but I need to understand the basis for your request." "I haven't been informed of any violation." The officer leaned slightly closer, his posture imposing. "You're being difficult," he said coldly. "This is a routine check. Step out of the vehicle or I'll have to escalate." A flicker of tension crossed Lisa's face, though her voice remained level. "Escalate? I'm simply asking for clarification. Am I being detained?" His expression hardened. "Do you always question law enforcement, or is tonight special?" The unspoken implication in his tone was clear, and it sent a wave of irritation through Lisa. She knew better than to let it show. Her gaze stayed locked with his, unwavering. "As I said, I'd like to comply, but I believe I'm entitled to know the reason for this stop." The officer's hand moved subtly toward the belt at his waist, where his holstered weapon rested. The motion wasn't overtly threatening, but it was deliberate enough to send a clear message. Lisa's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a routine stop. The undercurrent of hostility in his demeanor made that evident. "Last chance," the officer said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Step out of the car now, or I'll remove you myself. Lisa knew she was walking a fine line. Complying without reason could validate his abuse of power, but pushing back too hard could escalate the situation into something far worse. She tightened her grip on the wheel, her mind racing through the possibilities. "Officer," she began, her voice firm but composed, "I know the law. Unless you can provide a valid reason for this stop or inform me of a specific violation, your request is unwarranted." His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Then, with an audible exhale, he stepped back, clutching her documents. "Stay here," he said curtly, before turning and walking briskly to his patrol car. As he disappeared into the shadows, Lisa sat motionless, her thoughts churning. Her training told her to stay calm, to assess, to prepare. But the pit in her stomach remained. The silence outside her car was broken only by the faint murmur of the police radio crackling in the distance. Lisa knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Stay calm," she muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't the first time, and it won't be the last." Her eyes shifted to the rearview mirror, watching the officer's silhouette move inside his car. The flashing lights painted the dark road in sharp contrasts of red and blue, a glaring reminder of the precariousness of the moment. She could feel the tension mounting, the situation teetering on the edge of escalation. As the officer re-emerged from his vehicle, Lisa braced herself, knowing the real confrontation was just beginning. The unease that had started as a whisper in her mind was now a steady roar, amplified by the officer's heavy footsteps approaching her window once more. Lisa sat still, her breathing measured as Steve Jackson returned to her window. His steps were deliberate, each one reverberating with unspoken authority. Standing tall, the officer leaned slightly into her line of sight, his face set in a mask of irritation. "You're not making this any easier," he began, his voice clipped and devoid of any trace of courtesy. He held her registration and license loosely in one hand, as if they carried no weight. Lisa met his gaze, her tone calm but firm. "Officer, I've provided everything required by law. Is there an issue with my documents?" He smirked, his eyes narrowing as they scanned her face. "Issue? No. But I'll need to see your ID as well." Lisa's brow furrowed. "My license is a valid form of identification. It's all that's required during a traffic stop. Why are you asking for additional identification?" Steve shifted his weight, his stance widening as though to assert dominance. "You're asking a lot of questions for someone being pulled over. Maybe it's your attitude that's the problem." "My attitude," Lisa repeated, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "Officer, I've been cooperative. If there's a specific reason for this stop, I'd like to hear it." His expression hardened. "A car like this," he said, gesturing toward her SUV, "being driven at this time of night by someone like you. It doesn't add up." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Lisa's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her jaw clenching as she processed the barely veiled insult. "Someone like me," she repeated, her voice quieter now, though no less resolute. Steve shrugged, his smirk widening. "You know what I mean. You don't exactly fit the profile of someone driving a vehicle like this. Maybe it's borrowed or stolen." Lisa exhaled slowly, suppressing the sharp retort that threatened to escape. Instead, she spoke with deliberate precision. "Officer Jackson, let's be clear. Your implication is baseless, and your request is unlawful. I've complied with every legal requirement. If you have a valid reason for this stop, state it. Otherwise, I'd like to be on my way." His smirk vanished, replaced by a sneer. "You don't get to dictate how this goes. I'm the one in charge here." Lisa's gaze didn't waver. "Then I expect you to exercise that authority responsibly. What you're doing right now is an abuse of power." Steve leaned closer, his posture brimming with hostility. "Abuse of power? That's rich coming from someone who thinks they're above the law. I'm not about to let you walk away just because you can throw around some legal jargon." Lisa's voice remained level, though the tension between them was palpable. "I'm not above the law, officer, but I do know it. And right now, you're operating outside of it." For a moment, the air was thick with silence, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the distance. Steve's hand hovered near the belt at his waist, his fingers brushing against the handle of his flashlight. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered again, his tone sharp enough to cut. "No," Lisa replied firmly. "Not without a valid reason." Steve's eyes narrowed, his composure slipping. "You're pushing your luck, lady." "I'm asserting my rights," Lisa countered, her words steady and deliberate. "And unless you can articulate a legitimate cause for detaining me, this conversation is over." Steve's face flushed with anger. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Driving around in this expensive car, acting like the rules don't apply to you." Lisa tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "The rules do apply, officer, to everyone, including you." The words struck a nerve. Steve's hand twitched, his frustration boiling over as he slammed his palm onto the roof of her car. The sound echoed sharply, breaking the fragile calm. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he spat. Lisa didn't flinch, her demeanor unshaken. "Neither do you," she replied evenly. Steve stepped back, his chest rising and falling with barely restrained fury. He pointed a finger at her, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't over." With that, he turned on his heel, storming back toward his patrol car. Lisa watched him go, her pulse steady, but her thoughts racing. She knew this was far from resolved. "Holding your ground doesn't make this easier," she murmured to herself, "but it makes it necessary." As Steve climbed into his vehicle, the red and blue lights continued their relentless strobe, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Lisa's unease deepened. This wasn't about a traffic violation, it never had been. Lisa huffed softly, her breath clouding the cool air. As Steve's figure emerged once again from the patrol car, his expression darker than before, she braced herself for the inevitable escalation. Steve returned to Lisa's window, his frustration now palpable. Without preamble, he raised his hand and slammed it forcefully against the glass, the sharp sound reverberating through the quiet night. "I said, step out of the vehicle!" he barked, his voice harsh and commanding. Lisa kept her composure, her face an impassive mask. "Officer," she said evenly, "this level of aggression is unnecessary. I've complied with the law, and I'm staying in my vehicle unless you provide a lawful reason for me to step out." Steve's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "Don't tell me how to do my job," he snapped. He took a step back, pulling his radio from his shoulder. "Unit 3 requesting backup. 2 additional units to my location immediately." Lisa's eyes followed his movements, her mind racing as she processed the sudden escalation. Backup. He was trying to turn a simple stop into something far more severe. "This is a gross overreaction," she stated firmly, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. Steve leaned back toward the window, his face mere inches from hers. "You're the one escalating, ma'am. All you had to do was step out when I told you to." Lisa didn't break eye contact. "I'm asserting my rights, not escalating. If you feel threatened by that, perhaps you should reconsider your approach." His lips twisted into a sneer. "You think you're clever, don't you? Let's see how clever you are when backup arrives." Moments later, the faint sound of sirens in the distance confirmed his call had been answered. The red and blue lights of additional patrol cars soon joined the strobing glow around Lisa's SUV. 2 officers exited their vehicles and approached cautiously, their faces betraying varying degrees of curiosity and uncertainty. Steve gestured toward Lisa's car, addressing his colleagues. "She's being uncooperative, refusing to exit the vehicle, questioning my authority." One of the new officers, a younger man with a hesitant demeanor, glanced at Lisa, then back at Steve. "She seems calm," he said cautiously. Steve shot him a glare. "Calm? This is non-compliance. We don't tolerate that." Lisa rolled down her window a fraction further, her voice clear and unwavering. "Officers, I've complied with all legal requirements. Your colleague here is demanding I exit my vehicle without providing a lawful reason. I've asked for clarification, and he's responded with aggression." The younger officer looked visibly uncomfortable but didn't respond. The second officer, an older man with a hardened expression, merely nodded at Steve, signaling his support. Steve stepped closer again, his hand hovering dangerously close to the gun on his hip. "Last chance, lady. Step out of the car or I'll remove you myself." Lisa's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "If you touch me or my vehicle without cause, you'll face consequences." "This is an abuse of power." Steve's patience snapped. "Abuse of power?" he repeated mockingly. "You don't get to decide what's lawful here, I do." He reached for the door handle, yanking at it forcefully, but it held firm, locked. Lisa's eyes stayed locked on his, her expression resolute. "Unlock it," Steve growled. "No," Lisa replied simply. Steve's hand gripped the butt of his gun, his knuckles white. "Do you understand what's about to happen if you keep resisting?" Lisa inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I understand perfectly," she said, her tone cutting through his aggression like a knife. "And I also understand that your actions tonight are going to follow you for the rest of your career. I suggest you think carefully before taking another step." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Steve and Lisa. "Maybe we should de-escalate," he offered cautiously. Steve turned on him sharply. "De-escalate? Are you kidding me? This is exactly why we don't let rookies handle situations like this." The older officer placed a hand on Steve's shoulder, trying to steady him. "Let's not lose control here," he said quietly, though his tone lacked conviction. Steve shrugged him off, his focus fixed on Lisa. "You've got nerve," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "sitting there like you're untouchable." Lisa's gaze never wavered. "I'm not untouchable, Officer Jackson, but I am holding you accountable. That's what this is about, accountability." The younger officer took a tentative step closer. "Steve, maybe we should enough." Steve barked, his voice echoing into the night. His hand gripped his gun, the threat no longer subtle. Lisa knew the situation was teetering on the edge of chaos. Her calm was a thin veneer over the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. She needed to act decisively, but without further escalating the danger. "Officer Jackson," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension, "if you draw that weapon on an unarmed civilian who's done nothing wrong, you'll be proving exactly what kind of officer you are. And I promise you this won't end well for you." Her words struck a chord. Steve hesitated, his hand faltering for just a moment. The older officer moved in, stepping between Steve and Lisa's vehicle. "Enough, Jackson," he said, his voice more commanding now. "Stand down." Steve glared at his colleague, his face flushed with anger. "You're taking her side?" "I'm saying you need to back off before this gets worse," the older man replied. Lisa took the opportunity to reach for her phone. With deliberate movements, she held it up so that all three officers could see it. "What are you doing?" Steve demanded. Lisa pressed a number on speed dial and raised the phone to her ear. "Calling someone who outranks you," she said calmly. Steve's face contorted with fury. "You think you can threaten me with your connections?" Lisa didn't respond. Instead, she spoke clearly into the phone. "This is Lisa Carter. I'm being unlawfully detained by an officer who's escalating the situation. I need immediate assistance." The younger officer's eyes widened as the realization dawned. "Wait, Lisa Carter." Steve froze, his bravado momentarily cracking. "Who the hell are you calling?" Lisa lowered the phone, her gaze steady. "The sheriff. He'll be here shortly." The tension hung thick in the air, the silence broken only by the sound of distant sirens approaching. Lisa steadied herself, her phone already in her hand. With a firm tap on the screen, she started recording. "Officer Jackson," she said clearly, her voice calm but resolute, "I'm documenting this encounter as evidence of your unlawful behavior. Every action and word you take from this moment forward is being recorded." Steve froze for a fraction of a second, the unexpected move catching him off guard. "Turn that off," he snapped, his voice rough but laced with unease. "Recording public officials during the course of their duties is entirely within my rights," Lisa countered without hesitation, the camera lens fixed steadily on him. His jaw tightened. "You think a video is going to intimidate me?" Lisa's tone remained even. "It's not about intimidation. It's about accountability." Steve's demeanor shifted, his earlier aggression faltering as the realization crept in. This wasn't an ordinary civilian. He glanced at the younger officer standing a few paces behind him, his expression silently seeking validation. Mike Harris, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted between Lisa and Steve, a hint of doubt etched across his face. "Steve," Mike began cautiously. "Maybe we should stay out of this, Harris," Steve barked, cutting him off sharply. But Mike didn't back down entirely. "I'm just saying, she seems to know the law pretty well. Maybe we should wait for the sheriff." Lisa caught the exchange, her sharp eyes locking onto Mike. "Officer Harris, your hesitation tells me you know this situation isn't being handled correctly. Do the right thing. You're as responsible as he is if you stand by and let this escalate." Mike flinched slightly but didn't reply. Steve's face darkened, his earlier bravado now layered with visible frustration. "You don't get to lecture us on responsibility," he growled, his hand twitching near his belt. Lisa's phone camera followed the movement. "And you don't get to weaponize your authority without consequences," she said, her voice cutting through his attempt at intimidation. The distant wail of approaching sirens punctuated her words, signaling the arrival of the sheriff. Steve's composure cracked further. "Who the hell did you call?" he demanded, his voice rising. Lisa didn't lower her phone. "Someone with the authority to hold you accountable. Sheriff Morales will be here shortly. I suggest you reconsider your actions before then." Steve glanced at Mike again, this time with something closer to desperation than command. "We don't need the sheriff involved in this. I've got it under control." Mike hesitated, then finally spoke up. "Steve, maybe we should step back. If the sheriff's coming, it's probably best to let him handle it." Steve whipped around, glaring at his younger colleague. "What are you saying, Harris? You're taking her side?" "I'm saying we don't need to make this worse," Mike replied, his voice steady but tense. The sound of car doors slamming drew their attention as the sheriff's vehicle came to a stop a few feet away. Sheriff Ethan Morales, a middle-aged Latino man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped out, his eyes immediately scanning the scene. "Jackson!" Morales called out, his tone firm and questioning as he approached. "What's going on here?" Steve straightened, his posture stiffening. "Sir?" "This woman was refusing to cooperate during a routine stop. I was just trying to enforce compliance." Lisa didn't wait for Steve to twist the narrative further. "Sheriff Morales, my name is Lisa Carter. I've complied with every legal requirement, but your officer has escalated this situation without cause. I've been unlawfully detained, and I have the entire encounter recorded." Morales' sharp gaze shifted to Lisa, his brow furrowing. "Lisa Carter?" he repeated, the name clearly striking a chord. "Yes," Lisa confirmed. "Director of the FBI." The weight of her words hung in the air like a hammer. Steve visibly paled, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, no sound escaping. Mike took a step back, his discomfort now fully evident. Morales exhaled slowly, his expression hardening as he turned back to Steve. "Is this true? You stopped the director of the FBI?" Steve stammered, his usual confidence shattered. I didn't know who she was, sir. I was just doing my job." "Doing your job?" Morales cut him off, his tone ice cold. "Is threatening an unarmed civilian and calling unnecessary backup part of your job description?" Steve's face reddened, but he couldn't muster a response. Morales turned to Lisa. "Director Carter, I sincerely apologize for this. I'll ensure this matter is addressed immediately." Lisa lowered her phone slightly but kept her stance firm. "Sheriff, this isn't just about me. This is about a systemic issue, and tonight's incident is a glaring example of what needs to change." Morales nodded, his jaw tight. "Understood. I'll handle it." He faced Steve again, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Jackson, return to the station and prepare a full report. Harris, stay here and assist me." Steve hesitated, looking as though he might protest, but Morales' glare silenced him. With a stiff nod, Steve turned and retreated to his patrol car. Lisa watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew the situation wasn't entirely resolved, but the tide had turned. As the sheriff began his on-site assessment, Lisa's focus shifted from the immediate confrontation to the broader implications. Sheriff David Morales approached the scene with a deliberate stride, his eyes scanning the standoff in front of him. His expression was calm, but his body language exuded authority. The tension in the air was thick, and as he stopped a few feet from Steve Jackson, he wasted no time addressing the situation. "Jackson," Morales called firmly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Explain to me why I'm here." Steve turned stiffly, his face a mixture of irritation and discomfort. "Sheriff, this woman refused to comply during a routine stop. She wouldn't exit the vehicle when ordered, and she's been argumentative the entire time." Lisa, still seated in her SUV, watched the exchange without speaking. Her phone, held steadily in her hand, was no longer recording, but its presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Morales raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "Argumentative," he repeated. "And what exactly led you to order her out of the car?" Steve hesitated, his usual confidence faltering under Morales' scrutiny. I thought the vehicle looked suspicious. It's late at night, and she didn't seem cooperative." Morales' gaze sharpened. "Didn't seem cooperative?" His tone dropped slightly, carrying a dangerous edge. "Is that your justification for calling backup and escalating this into a 3-unit response?" Steve's mouth opened, but no coherent answer came out. Instead, he glanced at Mike Harris, who stood awkwardly nearby, as if hoping for support. "Officer Harris," Morales said, shifting his attention. "What's your take on this?" Mike shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Steve and Morales. "Sheriff, she provided her license and registration?" He began hesitantly, but Jackson insisted on additional ID, and she refused. She seemed within her rights." Steve spun toward Mike, his face flushed with anger. "Harris, what the hell are you enough?" Morales interrupted, his tone final. He turned back to Steve, his expression hardening. "Jackson, you called for backup. You've detained this woman without cause, and now I'm hearing that she complied with the law, but you pushed her beyond that. This isn't looking good for you." Steve straightened, his hands twitching at his sides. "I did what I thought was necessary," he snapped defensively. She was combative. "Stop," Morales cut him off. "You're digging yourself into a deeper hole. Stand down, Jackson." Steve's face darkened further, but he didn't move. Morales took a step closer, his voice lowering but growing even more commanding. "Hand over your weapon." The demand landed like a thunderclap. Steve's head jerked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Morales said, unflinching. "You're escalating the situation unnecessarily. Hand over your weapon now." For a moment, it seemed as if Steve might comply. His hand hovered near his holster, but instead of removing his weapon, he froze. His jaw tightened, his body rigid with defiance. "This is ridiculous," Steve spat. "You're siding with her. Over your own officer." "I'm siding with the law," Morales shot back. "And right now, you're in violation of it." Steve's fingers clenched into a fist before moving toward his gun. "This is bullshit," he muttered, his voice laced with anger. Morales' hand instinctively moved toward his own holster, and Mike stepped forward quickly, his voice filled with alarm. "Steve, don't." The moment hung precariously, the tension thick enough to cut. Steve's hand lingered on the grip of his gun, his face a mask of frustration and humiliation. "Jackson," Morales said, his voice low and steady. "If you draw that weapon, you'll be making the biggest mistake of your career and your life. Stand down." For a second, Steve looked ready to ignore the warning, his fingers twitching against the holster. Then, slowly, his hand fell away, his shoulders slumping as the defiance bled out of him. Morales didn't relax. "Hand over. Your weapon." This time, Steve obeyed. He unfastened his holster and handed over the gun with a sharp movement. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Morales took the weapon, passing it to Mike. "Harris, secure this," he ordered, his tone brisk. Mike nodded, taking the gun and stepping back. Morales turned his full attention to Steve. "You're done for the night. Go back to the station and wait for me there. We'll have a long conversation about your conduct." Steve didn't move at first, his feet seemingly rooted to the ground. "You can't be serious," he muttered. "I've never been more serious," Morales replied coldly. "Now go." Steve shot one last glare at Lisa before stalking off to his patrol car. The door slammed shut, and moments later, his vehicle roared to life and sped off into the night. Morales exhaled sharply, his focus shifting back to Lisa. "Director Carter," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Are you all right?" Lisa stepped out of her vehicle for the first time, her expression calm but resolute. "I'm fine," she said. "But your officer's behavior was unacceptable, Sheriff. This isn't just about me. It's about the systemic issues that allow this kind of abuse to happen." Morales nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. And I'll make sure this is handled properly." Lisa studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be holding you to that." Morales watched as Lisa retrieved her phone, the weight of the incident pressing heavily on him. This wasn't just a moment of individual misconduct. It was the tip of an iceberg he couldn't afford to ignore. Within hours of the incident, Lisa Carter's video recording, along with footage captured by a nearby resident, began circulating on social media. The clips painted an unambiguous picture of what had transpired. Officer Steve Jackson's aggressive escalation, his unjustified demands, and the eventual intervention by Sheriff David Morales. The footage struck a chord with viewers nationwide. The hashtags Justice for Lisa and Oscar End Police Abuse started trending almost immediately, flooding timelines and sparking debates. Prominent civil rights organizations like the ACLU and NAACP issued statements condemning Jackson's actions and demanding accountability from the local police department. "Another example of unchecked authority," one tweet read. "How many more incidents like this before we see real change?" By the next morning, major news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines blared, "FBI director harassed during traffic stop abuse of power." Exposed on video demand for justice, small-town police face scrutiny. Sheriff Morales was thrust into the spotlight, bombarded by calls from journalists, community leaders, and elected officials. At a hastily arranged press conference, he stood before a sea of reporters, his usually composed demeanor tinged with visible strain. "Good morning," Morales began, his voice steady but somber. "Last night, An incident occurred involving one of my officers and Director Lisa Carter of the FBI. Let me be clear. The behavior displayed by Officer Jackson was unacceptable and does not represent the values of this department. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every expression. Effective immediately, Officer Jackson has been placed on administrative leave pending a thorough investigation, Morales continued. Additionally, I have reviewed the available footage, and I can confirm that multiple violations of protocol occurred. This will not be ignored. Questions erupted from the room, reporters shouting over one another. Morales raised a hand to quiet them. We owe it to Director Carter and to our community to handle this transparently and justly, he said firmly. That's all I'll say for now. The press conference, while an attempt to address the growing outrage, did little to quell the public's anger. Protests began forming outside the police station, with signs reading "Accountability Now" and "Justice for All." The local community, galvanized by the incident, demanded not only action against Jackson, but broader reforms within the department. Lisa, meanwhile, had kept a low profile in the immediate aftermath. However, as the public outcry intensified, she decided it was time to address the situation directly. Standing at a podium during an FBI-organized press briefing, her presence commanded the room. I want to thank everyone who has reached out to express their support, Lisa began, her voice calm yet resolute. What happened to me during a routine traffic stop was not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a larger, systemic problem, one that disproportionately affects marginalized communities. She scanned the room, her gaze steady. This is not about a single officer or a single police department. This is about accountability, transparency, and the urgent need for reform. I am speaking out not because of my position, but because this is an issue that impacts millions of people who do not have the same platform to fight back. Her words resonated deeply, the gravity of her message underscored by the silence in the room. We cannot allow incidents like this to become normalized, Lisa continued. Accountability must be the standard, not the exception. Thunderous applause erupted as she stepped back from the podium, her message reverberating far beyond the room. In the days that followed, the movement gained even more momentum. Civil rights leaders amplified her call for change, holding rallies and town hall meetings to discuss police reform. Lawmakers at both the state and federal levels proposed new legislation to address bias in law enforcement, citing Lisa's experience as a catalyst for action. Sheriff Morales, under immense pressure, announced additional measures to restore public trust. This incident has exposed areas where we must improve, he said in a follow-up statement. Effective immediately, our department will implement mandatory anti-bias training, enhance body camera policies, and establish an independent review board for incidents of misconduct. The measures were welcomed by some, but criticized by others as insufficient. Training won't fix a broken system, one activist declared during a televised interview. We need systemic change, not Band-Aid solutions. Lisa remained a central figure in the ongoing discussions, her role as FBI director lending unparalleled weight to her words. During an interview on a national news program, she reiterated her commitment to driving change. This isn't about punishing one officer, she said. It's about ensuring that no one, regardless of race, gender, or status, has to fear the people sworn to protect them. Change starts here, and it starts now. Her words became a rallying cry, fueling not only outrage but also hope for meaningful reform. As the calls for justice grew louder, Lisa understood that the public's demand extended beyond apologies or disciplinary action. The people wanted systemic change, and they weren't willing to wait. The fallout for Steve Jackson was swift and unforgiving. Within hours of Sheriff Morales' press conference, the department formally placed him on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. His patrol car and weapon were confiscated, and he was escorted from the station under the wary eyes of his peers. While some of his colleagues remained silent, others murmured their disapproval behind closed doors. It was clear that Steve's conduct had crossed a line that even the so-called blue wall could not protect. The investigation delved deep, uncovering more than just a single night of misconduct. As files and complaints were reviewed, a pattern emerged, one that painted a damning picture of Steve's career. He's had multiple complaints filed against him, a spokesperson for the Independent Review Board announced during a press briefing. Many of these incidents involve allegations of excessive force and racial profiling, disproportionately targeting black drivers and other minorities. Lisa followed the updates closely, her resolve hardening with each revelation. This wasn't about a rogue officer making a mistake. This was a pattern of behavior unchecked by those who should have stopped it. One particularly egregious case involved a young black man Steve had pulled over 2 years earlier. The man had been accused of suspicious behavior while driving home from work. Despite having no contraband or weapons, he was forcibly removed from his vehicle, handcuffed, and detained for hours without charge. The man had filed a complaint, but it was dismissed without investigation. As more stories surfaced, so did questions about how Steve had been allowed to remain on the force. The department faced mounting scrutiny for failing to act on the red flags littered throughout his record. Civil rights groups demanded an external review, and state officials launched their own inquiry. The governor issued a statement condemning not just Steve's actions, but also the systemic failures that enabled him. Accountability doesn't stop with one officer, she said. We need to examine the structures that protect and perpetuate this behavior. The weight of public outrage bore down on Steve as he became the face of everything wrong with the system. His name was plastered across headlines and social media, accompanied by phrases like abuse of power and the badge that broke trust. The legal system quickly took notice. A grand jury convened to review the evidence against Steve, including body camera footage from the night he confronted Lisa. The recordings, along with Lisa's video and witness statements, painted a picture of blatant misconduct. Steve was charged with multiple counts, including official oppression, unlawful detention, and abuse of authority. His arraignment drew widespread attention, with cameras capturing his grim expression as he entered the courthouse. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor didn't mince words. This is not an isolated incident, she stated firmly. The defendant's actions on the night in question are part of a long-standing pattern of behavior. He has used his badge not to protect and serve, but to intimidate and discriminate. Steve's defense lawyer attempted to shift blame, arguing that his client had acted in good faith and was under pressure in a high-stress job. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting similar stories of harassment and abuse. Lisa testified as well, her words measured but powerful. This case is about more than one night, she said, her voice resonating in the courtroom. It's about accountability and the urgent need to address systemic issues within law enforcement. We cannot allow individuals like Officer Jackson to continue operating unchecked. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Steve was sentenced to prison, his career and reputation in ruins. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for reactions. Lisa's response was concise but firm. Today's verdict sends a message, she said, but it's only one step. True justice requires systemic change. As Steve was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the magnitude of his fall was undeniable. His peers in the department distanced themselves, publicly supporting the reforms Sheriff Morales had promised. But the damage to their credibility was already done. The broader impact of the case continued to ripple. Calls for reforms gained traction, with lawmakers pushing for stricter oversight and accountability measures in law enforcement. Civil rights organizations cited Steve's actions as proof of why federal legislation was needed to address systemic bias. Steve, now behind bars, became a cautionary tale. His name became synonymous with abuse of power, a stark reminder of what happens when accountability is ignored. Yet for Lisa, the case wasn't closed. But with Lisa, handling one individual wasn't enough to change an entire system. She knew the fight for justice extended beyond one courtroom and one officer. It required dismantling the structures that had allowed this behavior to thrive. Sheriff David Morales wasted no time implementing sweeping changes in the wake of the incident involving Steve Jackson. Standing before a room packed with officers, he made his position clear. This department will no longer tolerate abuse of power, Morales declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathered officers. Starting today, we're initiating mandatory anti-bias training for every single member of this force, from rookies to senior staff. A hand shot up from the back of the room. Sergeant Tom Reynolds, a grizzled veteran nearing retirement, didn't bother to mask his frustration. Sheriff, With all due respect, are you saying the rest of us are to blame for one man's actions? Morales' gaze hardened. I'm saying we all have a responsibility to ensure incidents like this never happen again. That starts with acknowledging the problem and committing to change. Reynolds snorted, crossing his arms. Feels like we're being punished for something we didn't do. The room buzzed with low murmurs of agreement from a handful of officers. Morales raised a hand, silencing the dissent. This isn't about punishment, he said firmly. It's about accountability. If you think training to recognize bias is a punishment, maybe you should take a hard look at why that bothers you. The room fell quiet, the tension thick. Morales didn't relent. This department serves the community, and right now, we've lost their trust. Rebuilding that trust starts with us. The reforms went beyond training. Morales introduced policies requiring body cameras to be activated during all interactions with civilians, with strict penalties for violations. Supervisors were tasked with reviewing footage regularly to ensure compliance and identify potential issues early. We're not just covering ourselves legally, Morales explained to the press during a community forum. We're creating transparency. Our goal is to protect both our officers and the public. The community's response was cautiously optimistic. During a town hall meeting, a local activist voiced what many were thinking. Sheriff Morales, these changes sound good on paper. But how do we know this isn't just a PR stunt? How do we know these measures will actually stick? Morales met her gaze directly. You'll know, because we're inviting the community to hold us accountable. We're establishing a civilian oversight board to review complaints and ensure that our actions match our words. The announcement sparked applause from some, but skepticism lingered. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight, another resident pointed out. You've got a long way to go. Morales nodded. I agree, but this is a start. Internally, the reforms created rifts within the department. Some officers, like Mike Harris, welcomed the changes. It's about time we did something like this, he said to a colleague. What happened with Jackson should have been a wake-up call for all of us. But others, like Reynolds, were less enthusiastic. This feels like they're stripping us of our authority, he grumbled during a private meeting with a group of like-minded officers. Next thing you know, we'll be asking criminals for permission before making an arrest. The division became increasingly apparent, with heated debates breaking out in break rooms and briefing sessions. Morales addressed the tension head-on. If you think these reforms weaken us, you're wrong, he said during a department-wide meeting. They make us stronger. A community that trusts its police force is a safer community. If you can't get behind that, maybe this isn't the place for you. Over time, the new policies began to show results. Body camera footage became a tool for resolving disputes quickly and fairly. Complaints of misconduct dropped as officers became more conscious of their actions. At a follow-up community forum, a local business owner spoke up. I'll admit, I was skeptical at first, she said, but I've noticed a difference. The officers I've interacted with lately seem more professional, more respectful. Still, not everyone was convinced. One good interaction doesn't erase years of bad ones, a young man countered. We'll see if this lasts. Morales acknowledged the sentiment. You're right, he said. We're not asking for blind trust. We're asking for the chance to prove we're committed to change. Lisa Carter, watching from a distance, observed the progress with measured optimism. She met with Morales to discuss the reforms, her questions pointed and direct. How are you measuring success? She asked. Morales gestured to a report on his desk. Complaint numbers, use of force incidents, community feedback, all of it. We're tracking everything. And what about accountability for officers resistant to these changes? Lisa pressed. Morales' expression darkened. I've made it clear. Resistance won't be tolerated. Anyone who can't adapt won't have a place here. Lisa nodded, satisfied for the moment but far from complacent. This is a good start, she said. But remember, real change isn't just about policies. It's about culture. That's the harder battle. Morales agreed, knowing the road ahead would be long. Lisa Carter's encounter with Officer Steve Jackson didn't just resolve itself in the confines of her SUV or Sheriff Morales' department. It erupted onto the national stage, catapulting her into the forefront of a growing movement. Overnight, she became a symbol of resilience and accountability. Her name and face synonymous with the fight against abuse of power in law enforcement. Invitations poured in from universities, civil rights organizations, and national forums. Each platform gave her the opportunity to shed light on the systemic flaws she had confronted firsthand. Standing before packed audiences, Lisa delivered speeches that cut through apathy and ignited a call for change. At a widely publicized civil rights summit, Lisa stepped onto the stage to a standing ovation. Her calm, authoritative demeanor commanded the room. She began not with a rehearsed introduction, but with a blunt recounting of her experience. "I was stopped, detained, and threatened for no reason other than the biases of one man in a position of power," she said, her voice steady. "And while my position as director of the FBI gave me the tools to fight back, millions of others don't have that privilege." The audience listened intently as she described the night that had transformed her into a reluctant figurehead for justice reform. "This isn't just about my story," Lisa continued. "It's about ensuring that no one, regardless of their race, gender, or status, has to fear those sworn to protect them." Her words struck a chord. When the speech ended, hands shot up across the room. One question stood out from a young black woman seated near the front. "How do we fight back when we feel powerless?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lisa paused before responding. "By finding your voice," she said. "By demanding accountability, by building alliances, and by refusing to accept the status quo. Change begins with courage, and courage is contagious." That message rippled across the country, amplified by news coverage and social media. Activists began invoking Lisa's name in rallies and marches, holding her up as an example of standing firm against injustice. Her story wasn't just repeated, it became a rallying cry. Hashtags like Stand with Lisa and Justice for All flooded online platforms, uniting people across demographics and geographic boundaries. Despite the overwhelming support, Lisa was acutely aware of the burden she now carried. In private interviews, she shared the complexities of her role. "Being a symbol is both empowering and daunting," she admitted during a televised panel discussion. "People see me as a voice for change, but change doesn't come from one person. It's collective effort, persistent advocacy, and most importantly, structural reform." Lisa's candor and relatability only deepened her impact. She wasn't content with simply recounting her ordeal. She used her platform to advocate for concrete changes. During a congressional hearing on police reform, she delivered testimony that left lawmakers visibly shaken. "We don't just need policies," she argued. "We need enforcement of those policies. Accountability cannot be optional. Every badge comes with responsibility, and every violation of that responsibility must have consequences." Her presence lent gravity to legislative discussions that had long been mired in partisan gridlock. Bills aimed at increasing police transparency and independent oversight gained traction, bolstered by Lisa's unwavering support. Amid these high-profile engagements, Lisa also took time to connect with communities directly. She visited schools, community centers, and grassroots organizations, sharing her story and listening to others. In one particularly emotional meeting, a teenage boy tearfully recounted his fear of being profiled by police. Lisa knelt to his level, her voice soft but resolute. "You have every right to feel safe," she told him. "And together, we're going to make sure that happens." The boy's mother, standing nearby, whispered a quiet thank you. Moments like these grounded Lisa, reminding her why she continued to push forward despite the personal toll. Her schedule became relentless, but she refused to slow down. Whether addressing thousands at a national convention or sitting one-on-one with victims of systemic injustice, her focus never wavered. She wasn't just sharing a message, she was building momentum for a movement. Still, Lisa understood that symbolic victories weren't enough. During a keynote speech at a leadership summit, she drove the point home. "Being a symbol is not the same as creating change," she said, her tone firm. "We can raise awareness, we can inspire action, but real change happens when we translate outrage into policy. Words can start a movement, but laws are what sustain it." The crowd erupted in applause, but Lisa's face remained solemn. She knew the road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. While Lisa had become a national icon, she remained acutely aware that lasting reform required more than speeches or symbolism. It demanded tangible, enforceable policy changes that could dismantle the systemic flaws she was fighting against. Lisa Carter's resolve, transformed from individual advocacy to national action as she leveraged her position as FBI director to champion sweeping reform in law enforcement practices across the United States. Her firsthand experience became a rallying point, exposing the urgent need for systemic change and sparking a movement too loud to ignore. At a congressional hearing packed with lawmakers, advocates, and journalists, Lisa sat at the center of the room, poised but unyielding. The tension was palpable as a senator posed a question. "Director Carter," he began, "many believe the incident you experienced was an isolated case of misconduct. What evidence do you have that such issues are systemic and require federal intervention?" Lisa leaned into the microphone, her voice steady and deliberate. "Senator, the evidence isn't anecdotal, it's data-driven. Studies repeatedly show that marginalized communities are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. My experience, while personal, reflects a broader pattern. If we fail to address it comprehensively, we're failing the very citizens we are sworn to protect." Her testimony detailed the reforms she believed were essential. Independent oversight boards for police departments, mandatory bias training, stricter standards for use of force, and federal grants tied to compliance with these measures. Each recommendation was backed by statistics and success stories from local departments, including Sheriff Morales' progress. Opposition to her proposals was immediate. Representatives from police unions argued the reforms would handcuff officers and lead to increased crime. One union leader, speaking at a televised debate, accused Lisa of undermining law enforcement. "Director Carter's agenda is anti-police," he claimed. "It assumes guilt and weakens our ability to do our jobs." Lisa, seated across from him, responded without hesitation. "This isn't about being anti-police. It's about being pro-accountability. Good officers who represent the majority should welcome these changes. They protect not only the public, but also the integrity of law enforcement." The exchange went viral, with clips of Lisa's calm yet powerful rebuttal dominating headlines. Social media exploded with support, as users hailed her as a symbol of reason in a polarized debate. Grassroots organizations quickly aligned with Lisa's mission. Civil rights groups, legal advocates, and community leaders organized rallies and town halls across the country, using her story as a catalyst for broader discussions. National celebrities lent their voices, amplifying the call for reform. At one rally in Washington, D.C., attended by tens of thousands, Lisa took the stage to thunderous applause. Her speech was concise but powerful. "We are not asking for special treatment," she said, her voice resonating through the crowd. "We are demanding equal protection under the law. Accountability is not a threat to justice. It is the foundation of it." The crowd erupted into chants of "No justice, no peace." As Lisa stepped back, her words igniting a fire that continued to spread. With public support behind her, Lisa worked closely with lawmakers to draft the National Law Enforcement Accountability Act, NLEAA. The legislation proposed independent federal oversight boards to investigate claims of misconduct, body camera mandates for all officers, with tampering or deactivation resulting in severe penalties, the elimination of qualified immunity in cases of clear abuse of power, federal funding tied to compliance with these reforms. As the bill made its way through Congress, fierce opposition emerged. Conservative lawmakers argued it infringed on states' rights, while police unions lobbied heavily against the removal of qualified immunity. The debates became heated, often spilling into the public sphere. In one particularly contentious hearing, a congressman accused Lisa of overreaching. "You're asking us to dismantle the framework of law enforcement," he said. "No," Lisa replied sharply. "I'm asking you to rebuild it on a foundation of integrity and accountability. That's not dismantling, it's reforming." Despite the pushback, progress was made. Several states preemptively adopted aspects of the NLEAA, introducing their own reforms to avoid federal intervention. High-profile police departments announced partnerships with independent review boards and initiated new training programs modeled after Lisa's recommendations. Corporate sponsors and philanthropists joined the movement, funding community police relationship-building initiatives. Schools began incorporating lessons on civic engagement and justice reform into their curriculums, inspired by Lisa's advocacy. However, the path wasn't without setbacks. In some regions, police unions successfully blocked reform efforts, while misinformation campaigns painted Lisa as a radical bent on dismantling law enforcement. Threats against her increased, requiring heightened security measures. Lisa addressed these challenges head-on in a national interview. "The resistance we're seeing isn't surprising," she admitted. "Change is uncomfortable, but discomfort is necessary when the status quo fails the people it's meant to serve." Her resilience inspired others to keep pushing, fueling marches, petitions, and continued calls for justice. Lisa's name became synonymous with reform. Universities invited her to speak on systemic change. Advocacy groups requested her input on community-led initiatives. Even international organizations began citing her work as a model for addressing similar issues abroad. At one such event, a young woman approached her after a panel discussion. "Because of you, I'm studying law," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to fight for justice the way you have." Lisa smiled, her expression a mixture of pride and determination. "Then keep fighting," she said. "Change takes all of us." The fight against injustice couldn't stop at isolated victories or fragmented reforms. Lisa knew the true battle was ensuring these changes endured, becoming the new standard, not the exception. In the weeks following her national campaign for police reform, Lisa Carter began receiving a flood of letters, emails, and messages from people across the country. Among them was a handwritten note from a young woman in Chicago. "Dear Director Carter," it began, "I watched your testimony before Congress, and for the first time, I felt seen. I've faced discrimination my entire life, and I thought things would never change. But you've shown me that we can fight back, that we can win. Thank you for inspiring me to believe in justice again." The letter struck a chord with Lisa. Sitting in her office late one evening, she folded the paper carefully and placed it in a growing stack of similar messages. Each letter was a reminder of why the fight mattered. It wasn't just about policies or headlines. It was about real people whose lives could be profoundly changed by accountability and justice. One letter in particular stood out. It came from the mother of a teenager who had been wrongfully detained by police in a case eerily similar to Lisa's own encounter. "You've given my son hope," the mother wrote. "For the first time, he doesn't feel powerless." Lisa's resolve hardened with every word she read. The wave of stories emerging from across the nation was proof that Lisa's actions had ignited a movement. People who had once stayed silent out of fear or resignation were now coming forward to share their own experiences of injustice. In one small town in Alabama, a group of residents banded together to demand the resignation of a police chief with a history of covering up misconduct. Their rallying cry, "If Lisa Carter can stand up to the system, so can we." Elsewhere, a young man in Los Angeles, previously reluctant to report his assault by an officer, filed a formal complaint with the support of a community advocacy group. His statement to the press was direct. "Watching Lisa Carter hold power accountable gave me the courage to speak up. It's time for all of us to stop accepting abuse as the norm." These individual acts of defiance began to coalesce into a larger wave. Towns and cities across the country saw an increase in public complaints against law enforcement misconduct, many of which led to investigations and reforms at the local level. Lisa became a symbol not only of resilience, but of empowerment. Advocacy groups reported a surge in volunteer sign-ups, and petitions demanding police reform garnered millions of signatures. To capitalize on this momentum, Lisa participated in a series of town hall meetings and panel discussions, engaging directly with communities eager for change. At one event in Detroit, a young Black woman stood during the QA session. "Director Carter," she began, her voice trembling, "I've always been afraid to talk about what happened to my brother. He was mistreated by police, but we didn't think anyone would believe us. After seeing what you've done, I finally feel like we have a chance." Lisa's response was firm, yet empathetic. "Your voice matters. Your brother's story matters. The system depends on silence to maintain the status quo. By speaking out, you're helping to break that cycle." The room erupted in applause. At another event in Atlanta, a retired police officer approached Lisa after the panel. "I served on the force for 30 years, he said. "I saw things I regret not stopping. You've reminded me that silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. Thank you for giving me the courage to speak out now, even if it's late." Lisa shook his hand. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she replied. The movement Lisa had inspired continued to grow, bolstered by her visible leadership and tireless advocacy. Major corporations pledged funding for community police relationship initiatives, while universities expanded their criminal justice programs to include coursework on systemic bias and accountability. Social media campaigns amplified these efforts, with hashtags like Stand with Lisa and Justice for All trending regularly. Videos of Lisa's speeches and interviews circulated widely, cementing her as a beacon of hope in the fight for equity. Yet, with every success came backlash. Critics accused Lisa of vilifying law enforcement and stoking division. Anonymous threats flooded her inbox, and protests against her reforms occasionally turned hostile. Lisa refused to back down. In a nationally televised interview, she addressed the criticism head-on. Change always faces resistance, she said, but the discomfort of reform pales in comparison to the suffering caused by injustice. We cannot let fear or opposition deter us from doing what's right. Her unwavering stance resonated deeply, fueling the resolve of those who looked to her for inspiration. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and public appearances, Lisa returned home to find an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was another letter, this one unsigned. Because of you, it read, I stood up to my supervisor when he pressured me to ignore a case of misconduct. I don't know what will happen next, but for the first time, I feel like I did the right thing. Thank you for showing us what true leadership looks like. Lisa sat back in her chair, the weight of the words settling over her. She knew the journey was far from over. The letters, the protests, the reforms, they were all steps in a much longer battle. Months after the confrontation that had catapulted her into the national spotlight, Lisa Carter returned to the quiet town where it all began. The drive along the familiar suburban roads felt surreal, the events of that night replaying in her mind. This time, however, she wasn't alone. The movement she had inspired was now a force, its impact rippling through communities far beyond the town's borders. Lisa pulled into the parking lot of the sheriff's station, stepping out of her SUV with the same calm resolve she had displayed that fateful night. Sheriff David Morales was waiting for her at the entrance, his expression a mixture of respect and determination. Director Carter, he greeted, extending his hand. Sheriff Morales, Lisa replied, shaking it firmly. I appreciate you making time. Of course, Morales said. It's not every day the director of the FBI pays us a visit. They stepped inside, bypassing the usual formalities. Morales led her to a conference room where several folders and reports were neatly arranged on the table. These are the updates you requested, Morales said, gesturing toward the documents. Body camera compliance is up to 97%, complaints of misconduct have dropped by 40%, and our Civilian Oversight Board has reviewed every case filed in the last 6 months. Lisa flipped through the files, nodding as she scanned the data. It's a strong start, she acknowledged. But what about the cultural shift? Numbers only tell part of the story. Morales leaned back slightly, his expression turning serious. That's been the harder battle. There are still officers who resist the changes, who feel like they're under attack. But we're working on it. Training helps, but it's going to take time to rebuild trust inside and outside the department. Lisa looked up from the reports, meeting his gaze. That's the reality of systemic reform. It's not just policies, it's people. It's changing the way they think, the way they act, and the way they see their role in the community. Morales nodded. We're committed to it, but I won't lie. It's a tough road. Some days, it feels like 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Lisa offered a small smile. The fact that you're willing to face those challenges head-on says a lot. Change doesn't come easy, but it's worth the fight. As they continued discussing the department's progress, the conversation turned to the broader implications of Lisa's work. The movement you started has changed everything, Morales said. People are watching now. They're asking questions, holding us accountable in ways they never did before. That's the point, Lisa replied. Accountability shouldn't be the exception. It should be the expectation. Their meeting concluded, and Morales escorted her back outside. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as they stopped by her vehicle. Thank you, Director Carter, Morales said, his tone sincere. For everything. You didn't just hold us accountable, you gave us a chance to be better. Lisa shook his hand again. This isn't just your fight, Sheriff. It's all of ours. Before leaving town, Lisa stopped by a local community center where a group of young people had gathered for a workshop on civic engagement. Invited as a surprise guest, she stepped into the room to a round of applause. One of the participants, a teenage girl, raised her hand hesitantly. "Director Carter, how do you stay hopeful when the fight seems so overwhelming?" Lisa paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because hope isn't passive," she said. "Hope is action. Every time someone stands up against injustice, every time a voice is raised for accountability, that's hope in motion. And as long as we keep moving forward, no matter how slowly, we're making progress." The room was silent for a moment before erupting into applause once more. Lisa left the community center with a renewed sense of purpose. These were the people she was fighting for, the ones who would carry the torch long after her work was done. And so, Lisa Carter's journey continues, a relentless pursuit of justice in the face of systemic challenges. Her story isn't just about one woman standing up against abuse of power. It's about the ripple effect of courage, accountability, and the unyielding belief that change is possible. But the question remains, how can each of us play a role in building a fairer, more just society? If Lisa's story inspired you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel to help spread this message of hope and action. Together, we can be the change our world needs.
The sun was still rising over Atlanta as Judge Michelle Carter adjusted her hat and stepped out of her car, parked on a cracked curb in the neighborhood she'd grown up in. Wearing her favorite faded denim jacket and a pair of sneakers, she felt a strange mix of nostalgia and melancholy as she walked the familiar streets of her childhood. The corner store where she and her friends used to buy candy was still standing, though now it boasted a bold red "For Lease" sign in the window. The vibrant mural on the side of the building, depicting a young black girl reading a book, had faded under years of neglect. Michelle breathed deeply, letting the sharp morning air ground her. It had been years since she'd taken time to walk these streets, and for once, she wasn't Judge Carter, the woman known for her sharp rulings and fiery speeches about equality. Today, she was just Michelle, a woman trying to connect with her roots. But that connection was rudely interrupted when she stepped into the small convenience store on the corner. The store was quiet, save for the faint hum of a refrigerator in the back. Michelle grabbed a bottle of water and a granola bar, her mind wandering. She was so lost in thought that she barely noticed the cashier, a wiry young man, watching her every move. When she approached the counter, the cashier didn't greet her. Instead, he pressed a button below the register, his hand trembling slightly. "Is everything all right?" Michelle asked, her voice calm but slightly confused. Yeah," the cashier mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Just hold on a second." Michelle frowned but said nothing, pulling a few dollars from her pocket. Before she could hand them over, the bell above the store's door jingled sharply. Two police officers, Deputy Michael Blake, a tall man with a buzz cut, and Officer Travis Hunter, who carried a constant smirk, stepped inside, their boots heavy against the linoleum floor. "Ma'am," Blake said, his tone stern, "we got a report of suspicious activity in the area. Can you show us what's in your bag?" Michelle blinked, momentarily stunned. "Excuse me?" Hunter folded his arms. "You heard him. Open the bag." "I haven't stolen anything," Michelle said firmly, though her heartbeat quickened. She held up the water and granola bar. "I was just about to pay for these." Blake's eyes narrowed. "We're going to need you to step outside with us." "Step outside? For what reason?" "Ma'am, don't make this difficult," Hunter interjected, his smirk growing. "We're just doing our job. Now, let's go." Michelle took a steadying breath. "I'm a judge, Judge Michelle Carter. I can assure you, this is a misunderstanding." Blake chuckled, a low, disbelieving sound. "A judge, huh? You got any ID to prove that?" Michelle reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her wallet. She handed over her identification, watching as Blake scrutinized it. Hunter leaned over to glance at the ID as well. He let out a sharp laugh. "This is fake as hell. A judge? You've got to be kidding me." "It's not fake," Michelle said, her voice growing colder. "Call your supervisor if you don't believe me." Blake ignored her suggestion and tossed her ID back at her. "You know, people like you always have some story, don't you? People like me?" Michelle's eyebrows shot up. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "You know exactly what I mean," Hunter said, stepping closer. "Now! Either you come with us or we'll cuff you right here." Michelle stared at them, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of her upbringing in this moment. The lessons her parents had drilled into her about staying calm, keeping her hands visible, and never raising her voice. But this was beyond humiliating. "Fine," she said, her voice like ice. "Let's go." As they escorted her out of the store, Michelle noticed the growing crowd of onlookers gathering on the sidewalk. She kept her head high, refusing to show any sign of weakness, but inside, she felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Blake opened the back door of the patrol car and motioned for her to get in. "Watch your head," he said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. Michelle hesitated for a moment, then climbed in. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in her ears. She glanced out the window, catching the eyes of a young black girl standing on the sidewalk with her mother. The girl looked up at her, confusion and fear written across her face. The ride to the precinct was silent, save for the crackle of the police radio. Michelle kept her hands folded in her lap, her mind already calculating the steps she'd need to take to address this injustice. When they arrived at the station, Blake and Hunter led her inside, their grips firm on her arms. She glanced around, noting the tired faces of officers typing at desks, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the faint smell of burnt coffee. "All right," Blake said, guiding her toward a bench. "Sit tight while we process you." "Process me for what?" Michelle asked, her composure starting to crack. "I haven't committed a crime." "Disturbing the peace," Hunter said with a smirk, "and maybe resisting arrest. We'll see." Michelle stared at him, her jaw tightening. "You're making a mistake. A serious mistake." Hunter leaned in, his face inches from hers. "You can keep saying that all you want, sweetheart. It doesn't change a thing." Michelle turned away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. She glanced around the station, noting the lack of urgency among the officers. It was clear they didn't see her as a priority, or perhaps they simply didn't care. Hours passed. No one offered her water, food, or even the decency of an explanation. Her attempts to speak to someone in charge were met with dismissive waves or curt replies. Finally, she spotted a familiar face, Angela Wallace, her best friend and a prominent civil rights attorney, striding into the precinct with fire in her eyes. "What the hell is going on here?" Angela demanded, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. Blake and Hunter exchanged a glance, but said nothing. "Don't look at each other. Look at me," Angela snapped. "You're holding Judge Michelle Carter in this station without cause. I want her released immediately, or I'll have a lawsuit on your desk by morning." Blake cleared his throat. Nam, we were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Angela cut him off, her voice rising. "Protocol is verifying someone's identity before dragging them down here like a criminal. Protocol is treating everyone with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin. Don't you dare lecture me on protocol." The room fell silent as Angela turned to Michelle, her expression softening. "Are you all right?" Michelle nodded, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her calm demeanor. "Let's just get out of here." Angela turned back to Blake and Hunter, her gaze sharp. "You'll be hearing from me." As they walked out of the station, Michelle felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as she stepped into the cool evening air, she made a silent vow. This humiliation would not be in vain. This was just the beginning. The media storm started before Michelle had even unlocked her front door that night. She hadn't expected to become the center of attention so quickly, but it seemed word of her wrongful detention had spread like wildfire. By the time she stepped inside, her phone was vibrating incessantly on the kitchen counter. Text messages, missed calls, and emails flooded the screen. Angela, ever the proactive attorney, had wasted no time alerting the press. She had called in every favor she was owed, ensuring the story would make headlines before the police department could spin their version. Michelle wasn't sure whether to be grateful or exhausted. She stood by the window of her modest, well-kept home, watching the city lights glimmer in the distance. Her usually serene evening routine, a glass of wine, some jazz on the record player, felt alien now. All she could think about was the way those officers had looked at her, as if her words were worthless, her identity laughable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, Angela stood on the other side, holding a stack of papers and looking like she was running on nothing but adrenaline. "I need coffee," Angela announced, brushing past Michelle and heading straight for the kitchen. "Black, strong, no sugar. And sit down, because we have a lot to talk about." Michelle closed the door, sighing as she followed her friend. "Angela, I haven't even had time to breathe." "Breathe later," Angela said, already rifling through her papers. "Do you have any idea how big this is? They didn't just arrest a judge. They arrested you, Michelle. A black woman who grew up in one of the most underserved neighborhoods in Atlanta and worked her ass off to sit on the bench. This is systemic racism at its most blatant, and we're going to make them pay for it." Michelle poured herself a glass of water, her hands steady despite the turmoil brewing inside her. "I'm not interested in revenge, Angela. I'm interested in change." "Good, because change is exactly what we're going to force on them," Angela said, slapping the papers onto the kitchen table. "I've already drafted a formal complaint to file with the department, but this needs to go further. Public hearings, press conferences, demands for policy reform. Hell, I want every officer in that precinct retrained or fired." Michelle sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. "I appreciate your passion, but this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been treated like they don't matter. If we're going to do this, it has to be about the system, not just two officers." Angela leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "You think I don't know that? This isn't my first case, Michelle. But those two officers, Blake and Hunter, they're the face of the problem. We take them down, and we send a message to every other cop who thinks they can get away with this." Michelle's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen. Another journalist, another request for an interview. She ignored it and looked back at Angela. "What if I don't want to be the face of this fight? What if I just want to go back to work and pretend this never happened?" Angela's expression softened, but only slightly. "Then you wouldn't be the Michelle Carter I know. The woman who spent her weekends tutoring kids in this very neighborhood, who gave speeches about justice and equality even when no one was listening. You've always been a fighter, Michelle. Don't stop now." Michelle exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She knew Angela was right. Ignoring this wouldn't make it go away. If anything, it would make things worse, not just for her, but for everyone who looked like her. "Fine," she said finally, "but we do it my way. No smear campaigns, no theatrics. Just the truth." Angela grinned triumphant. "Deal." The next morning, Michelle arrived at the courthouse early, as was her habit. The familiar sight of the grand marble steps and towering columns usually filled her with a sense of purpose. But today, they felt like a fortress she wasn't sure she could breach. She stepped inside, nodding politely at the security guards who greeted her with the usual deference. At least they still recognized her authority, unlike Blake and Hunter. Her courtroom was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of polished wood and old books. She ran her fingers along the edge of her bench, letting the cool surface ground her. This was her domain, her sanctuary. But even here, she couldn't escape the memories of the previous day. Judge Carter, a voice called from the doorway. She turned to see her clerk, Mia, standing hesitantly with a stack of files in her arms. The young woman looked nervous, her usual bright smile replaced with a furrowed brow. "Yes, Mia, I I want to say I'm sorry about what happened, Mia said, stepping closer. I saw the news this morning. It's awful what they did to you. Michelle managed a small smile. Thank you, Mia. But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Mia nodded, setting the files down on the desk. If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know. Actually, there is, Michelle said, an idea forming in her mind. I need you to pull every case we've handled in the last 5 years involving allegations of police misconduct. I want to see if there's a pattern. Mia's eyes widened. That's going to be a lot of cases, Judge. I know, Michelle said firmly, but it needs to be done. As the day went on, Michelle threw herself into her work, using the steady rhythm of court proceedings to keep her mind focused. But the tension in the back of her mind never fully disappeared. By lunchtime, she couldn't avoid it any longer. She stepped into her chambers and opened her laptop, pulling up a search engine. Deputy Michael Blake, she typed, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before hitting enter. The first few results were unremarkable. Social media profiles, mentions in local news stories about routine police work. But then she saw it. A lawsuit filed 3 years ago by a black man who had accused Blake of excessive force during a traffic stop. The case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Michelle's stomach churned as she scrolled further. Another complaint, this time from a Hispanic woman who claimed Blake had harassed her during a routine call to her apartment. That case, too, had gone nowhere. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her arrest. Blake and Hunter were part of a much larger problem, a system that protected officers like them at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she didn't ignore it. Angela, she said as soon as she answered. We need to talk. About what? Angela asked, her voice cautious. Blake has a history, Michelle said, her tone grim. A long one. And I'm willing to bet Hunter does too. If we're going to do this, we need to expose everything, not just what happened to me, but every case they've mishandled, every life they've disrupted. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Angela spoke. I'll start digging, but you know this isn't going to be easy, right? The department will fight us every step of the way. Michelle's grip tightened on the phone. Let them fight. I'm not backing down. As she hung up, Michelle felt a flicker of determination ignite inside her. This was bigger than her, bigger than 2 officers, even bigger than Atlanta. This was about justice, real justice. And she wasn't going to stop until she got it. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The gallery was packed, an unusual sight for a midweek hearing. Reporters lined the back row, their cameras discreetly tucked away for now, while the faces of activists and community leaders reflected a mix of hope and determination. Among them was John Legend, his presence amplifying the weight of the moment, and even Oprah Winfrey herself had sent a representative to observe the proceedings. At the center of it all, Michelle Carter sat behind the bench, her face composed and regal. Her black robe, a symbol of her authority, felt heavier than usual today. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. Deputy Michael Blake and Officer Travis Hunter were seated at the defense table, flanked by their legal counsel. Hunter sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, while Blake avoided eye contact altogether, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. They looked less like men of authority and more like schoolboys waiting for detention. The irony wasn't lost on Michelle. Just days ago, they looked at her with such disdain, so sure of their power over her. Now, the roles had been reversed, and they were the ones being scrutinized under the harsh light of justice. All rise, the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Everyone stood as Michelle entered the room, but this time, the weight of their eyes felt different. There was respect, yes, but also an unspoken acknowledgement of the injustice she'd endured. She let it fuel her resolve as she took her seat. You may be seated, she said, her voice steady. The prosecution began its opening arguments. painting a picture of systemic issues within the police department. The lawyer, a sharp and eloquent woman named Naomi Green, didn't hold back. This case is not just about two officers who overstepped their authority, Naomi said, pacing the floor with purpose. It's about a culture of impunity that has been allowed to fester within the Atlanta Police Department. Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter didn't act in a vacuum. They are products of a system that prioritizes protection over accountability. Michelle watched the jury closely, noting their reactions. Some nodded in agreement. Others remained impassive, their expressions unreadable. When the defense took its turn, the tone shifted. Blake and Hunter's lawyer, a graying man with a deep Southern drawl named Frank Dobson, leaned heavily on the narrative of doing their job. These men were following standard procedure, Dobson argued, his voice calm but firm. In a high-crime area, suspicion is a necessary tool. They acted on instinct and training, not malice. Michelle's eyes narrowed. It was a familiar argument, one that had been used countless times to excuse police misconduct. But today, it wouldn't go unchallenged. The first witness was called, a young black man named Darren Wilson, who had been one of Blake's prior victims. Darren took the stand with visible nerves, his hands gripping the edges of the seat. Mr. Wilson, Naomi began, her tone gentle but firm. Can you tell us about your encounter with Deputy Blake? Darren nodded hesitantly. It was about 3 years ago. I was driving home from work late at night, and he pulled me over. Said I had a broken taillight, but my taillights were fine. Then he started asking if I had drugs in the car, if I'd been drinking. I hadn't done anything wrong. Did he search your car? Yes, Darren said, his voice tightening. He didn't ask for permission, just told me to get out and started going through everything. He didn't find anything, but he kept me there for over an hour. Made me late to pick up my daughter from the babysitter. Did you file a complaint? I did, Darren said, glancing nervously at Blake, who avoided his gaze. But nothing happened. They said there wasn't enough evidence. Naomi nodded sympathetically. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, Dobson took a different approach. Mr. Wilson, he said, his tone almost condescending, you say your taillights weren't broken, but isn't it possible you simply didn't notice? After all, you were driving at night. Darren hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I check my car regularly. I know they weren't broken. Dobson smirked. And yet, here we are. No further questions. The tension in the room grew as more witnesses took the stand. Each story painted a damning picture of Blake and Hunter's behavior. Patterns of racial profiling, intimidation, and unwarranted detentions. Michelle listened intently, her expression giving away nothing, but inside, her anger simmered. Finally, the time came for the officers themselves to testify. Blake was called first. He walked to the stand with measured steps, his face carefully neutral. Deputy Blake, Naomi began, her voice sharp. Can you explain why you arrested Judge Carter on the morning in question? Blake shifted in his seat. We received a call about suspicious activity at a store. When we arrived, Judge Carter matched the description given by the caller. Suspicious activity? Naomi raised an eyebrow. You mean shopping? Blake's jaw tightened. She refused to cooperate at first, which raised further suspicion. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. Did it ever occur to you to verify her identity before placing her under arrest? Blake hesitated, his discomfort evident. I thought her ID was fake. You thought, Naomi repeated, her tone biting. But you didn't verify. Isn't it true, Deputy Blake, that Judge Carter told you who she was multiple times? Blake glanced toward Hunter, who avoided his gaze. Yes, but no further questions, Naomi said, cutting him off. Hunter was next. His demeanor was markedly different, defensive, even defiant. Officer Hunter, Naomi began. Can you explain why you laughed when Judge Carter presented her identification? Hunter's smirk returned. Because it was ridiculous. A judge in that neighborhood? Dressed like that? Come on. The room erupted into murmurs, and Michelle's stomach twisted. This was exactly the kind of blatant bias she had spent her career fighting against. Ridiculous. Naomi's voice rose, her indignation palpable. So, in your professional opinion, people from certain neighborhoods can achieve positions of power? Hunter's smirk faltered. That's not what I meant, but that's what you said. Naomi shot back. No further questions. As Hunter stepped down, the tension in the room was palpable. The prosecution had made its case clear. Blake and Hunter weren't just flawed. They were products of a system that encouraged and enabled their behavior. Michelle adjourned the hearing for the day, her mind spinning as she left the bench. She knew the hardest part was yet to come. The jury's deliberation would be a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community. As she stepped into her chambers, she found Angela waiting for her, a grim smile on her face. That was brutal, Angela said, handing Michelle a cup of tea. It needed to be, Michelle replied, sinking into her chair. Angela nodded. We're exposing them piece by piece. But you know this isn't just about these two. The whole system is on trial. I know, Michelle said softly, staring at the tea in her hands. And we can't afford to lose. The weight of that truth hung heavy in the room, but Michelle knew she couldn't back down. This was bigger than her. It always had been. The courtroom was quieter the next morning, but the tension was even heavier. By now, the story of Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter's wrongful arrest of Judge Michelle Carter had reached every corner of Atlanta and beyond. News outlets across the country had picked up the case, sparking heated debates about race, policing, and justice in America. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their chants echoing through the marble halls. Inside the courtroom, Michelle adjusted her robe as she prepared to step back onto the bench. She felt the weight of the case more acutely today. This wasn't just about two men who had wronged her. It was about addressing the rot in the system that had allowed them to act with impunity. Angela had spent the evening with Michelle, going over the case files and evidence they gathered on Blake and Hunter. The more they dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Blake alone had been named in 8 separate complaints over the past 5 years. Hunter, though newer to the force, had already been flagged twice for questionable conduct. And yet, nothing had ever come of it. This was the pattern Michelle had feared. A culture protecting officers at all costs, no matter the harm they caused. She stepped into the courtroom, her face unreadable, and called the session to order. The prosecution was ready to present their final pieces of evidence. Pieces that Michelle knew could be devastating for the defense. Naomi Green approached the bench with the confidence of someone who knew the cards were stacked in her favor. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Captain Robert Hayes to the stand, she announced. The courtroom murmured in surprise. Captain Hayes was the commanding officer at the precinct where Blake and Hunter worked. His name had come up several times in the case, though until now, he had avoided direct scrutiny. When Hayes took the stand, he looked uncomfortable. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a sharp uniform, but his confident posture couldn't hide the nervous glint in his eyes. Captain Hayes, Naomi began, how long have you been with the Atlanta Police Department? 22 years, Hayes replied, his voice steady but guarded. And how long have you been the commanding officer of the precinct where Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter are assigned? 7 years. Naomi nodded. In those 7 years, how many complaints of misconduct have been filed against officers under your command? Hayes shifted in his seat. I don't have that exact number in front of me. Would you say it's more than 10? Naomi pressed. Hayes hesitated. Possibly more than 20? He sighed. Yes. And how many of those complaints resulted in disciplinary action? Hayes cleared his throat. A few, maybe 2 or 3. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and Michelle banged her gavel for silence. Captain Hayes, Naomi continued, her voice sharp. Are you aware that Deputy Blake has been named in 8 separate complaints of misconduct, including excessive force and racial profiling? I am, Hayes admitted, and yet he remains on the force. Why? Hayes hesitated, his discomfort evident. Not all complaints are substantiated. We have a process for reviewing these claims, and if there's no concrete evidence, we can't take action. Naomi's eyes narrowed. And who oversees this review process? The Internal Affairs Division, Hayes replied. Isn't it true, Captain Hayes, that the Internal Affairs Division often relies on the testimony of other officers to determine the validity of a complaint? Yes, Hayes said reluctantly. And isn't it also true that officers rarely testify against their colleagues? Hayes didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Yes. Naomi paused, letting the weight of his admission settle over the courtroom. No further questions, Your Honor, she said, returning to her seat. Michelle watched Hayes step down, his shoulders slumped. She could see the cracks forming in the defense's case. But she also knew this wasn't just about exposing 2 bad officers or even a negligent captain. It was about forcing a reckoning within the entire department. The defense called their own witnesses, but their arguments felt weaker by the day. Dobson tried to paint Blake and Hunter as hard-working officers who had been caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding, but the evidence against them was too overwhelming. It was the final piece of evidence, however, that sealed their fate. Your Honor, Naomi said as she rose from her seat, the prosecution would like to submit video footage from the body cameras worn by Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter on the day of Judge Carter's arrest. Michelle's pulse quickened. She had seen the footage already. It had been sent to her anonymously 2 days earlier, and she'd handed it over to Naomi immediately. But seeing it play out in the courtroom was something else entirely. The footage began with Blake and Hunter arriving at the convenience store. Their conversation as they exited the car was caught on audio. Another call about a suspicious black person, Hunter said, his tone mocking. What else is new? Blake chuckled. Bet she's just another one of those welfare queens trying to hustle free stuff. Michelle felt her stomach churn, but she kept her face neutral as the video continued. The footage showed their interaction with Michelle in painful detail. Her calm demeanor, her repeated attempts to explain who she was, and their blatant dismissal of her words. She says she's a judge, Hunter said at one point, laughing. Yeah, and I'm the damn president. The video ended with Michelle being handcuffed and escorted out of the store, her head held high even as customers stared in confusion and disbelief. The courtroom was silent as the screen went dark. Naomi turned to the jury. This is the reality of policing in our country, she said, her voice filled with emotion. A system where assumptions and prejudice override facts and human decency. Judge Carter's arrest wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a much larger disease. And it's time we start holding people accountable. Dobson stood to cross-examine, but it was clear his confidence had been shaken. His questions were weak, his arguments half-hearted. When the day's proceedings ended, Michelle retreated to her chambers, feeling the full weight of the day pressing down on her. Angela was waiting for her, as always, with a look of cautious optimism. They're crumbling, Angela said, sitting across from Michelle. They are, Michelle agreed. But this isn't just about winning the case. It's about what happens after. Angela nodded. You're right, but we have to take this one step at a time. And right now, we're winning. Michelle leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The end was in sight, but the road ahead still felt long. This isn't just a fight for justice, she said softly. It's a fight for change. Angela smiled. And if anyone can win that fight, it's you. Michelle opened her eyes, a flicker of determination shining through her exhaustion. Tomorrow would be the final day of the trial, and the stakes couldn't be higher. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. And she wasn't going to stop until she saw it through to the end. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the final day of the trial. A line of protesters snaked around the courthouse steps outside, chanting for justice, their signs raised high in the chilly morning air. Inside, the tension was almost suffocating as everyone waited for the jury's verdict. Michelle Carter sat behind the bench, her black robe as immaculate as ever. But today, something in her felt different. She was no longer just a judge presiding over a case. She was a symbol, a voice for so many who had been silenced. The weight of it all was immense, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. Across the room, Deputy Michael Blake and Officer Travis Hunter sat at the defense table, their faces pale and tight with anxiety. The bravado they'd shown earlier in the trial had vanished. Now, they looked like men who understood the gravity of their actions and the consequences they were about to face. "Will the jury foreperson please rise?" the clerk announced, pulling everyone's attention to the front of the room. A middle-aged woman with a calm, measured demeanor stood, holding a piece of paper in her hands. In the matter of Deputy Michael Blake and Officer Travis Hunter, she began, "On the charge of wrongful arrest, we, the jury, find the defendants guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if the room needed time to process them. Then the murmurs began, growing louder as reporters scrambled to write down their notes and spectators whispered to each other. Michelle banged her gavel. "Order in the court," she said firmly, though inside, she felt a rush of relief. Naomi Green stood, her expression triumphant. "Your Honor, the prosecution recommends immediate disciplinary action, as well as a full review of the Atlanta Police Department's policies and procedures." Dobson, the defense attorney, stood as well, though his posture was more resigned and defiant. "Your Honor, the defense asked for leniency in sentencing. My clients—" "Enough," Michelle said, cutting him off. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. She turned her gaze to Blake and Hunter, who both shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "This case was never just about you," she began, her tone measured but powerful. "It was about a system that has allowed people like you to operate without accountability for far too long. Your actions weren't just a mistake. They were a betrayal of the public trust. And that betrayal has consequences." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter, I hereby sentence you both to immediate suspension without pay, pending termination. Furthermore, I am recommending that the Atlanta Police Department initiate a full independent review of its officers and their practices. This court will not tolerate prejudice disguised as protocol." The room erupted again, this time with applause from the gallery. Protesters outside could be heard cheering as word of the verdict spread. Blake and Hunter stared at the floor, their expressions hollow. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the magnitude of what they had done, not just to Michelle, but to the community they were sworn to serve. As the courtroom emptied, Michelle remained seated, watching the crowd disperse. Angela appeared by her side, a proud smile on her face. "You did it," Angela said softly. "We did it," Michelle corrected. Angela shook her head. "No, Michelle, this was you. You turned what could have been just another humiliating moment into something bigger, something that's going to matter for years to come." Michelle smiled faintly, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. The fight wasn't over. There were still policies to change, officers to train, and a community to rebuild. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. That evening, Michelle returned to the neighborhood where it had all started. She parked her car and stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, her heels clicking against the pavement. The convenience store where Blake and Hunter had arrested her was still open, its windows glowing softly in the fading light. Inside, the same young cashier who had called the police was restocking shelves. He froze when he saw Michelle, his face turning pale. "Judge Carter," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think you'd come back here. I didn't come to hold a grudge," Michelle said gently. "I came because I believe people can change, if they're willing to learn." The cashier swallowed hard, his eyes downcast. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called them. I thought I was doing the right thing." Michelle studied him for a moment, then nodded. The right thing starts with treating people with respect. Remember that. The young man nodded quickly, his shoulders slumping in relief. Michelle left the store and began walking down the street, the cold air biting at her skin. The mural on the side of the building caught her eye again, the faded image of the young black girl reading a book. She stopped, her chest tightening as she studied it. Tomorrow, she thought, she would make some calls. She knew a few local artists who could restore the mural, bring it back to life. The neighborhood deserved that much. As she walked back to her car, a young girl ran up to her, clutching a small notebook. "Judge Carter," the girl said, her eyes wide with excitement. "Can I ask you something?" Michelle crouched down, so they were eye level. "Of course. Are you going to put all the bad guys in jail?" Michelle smiled warmly. "I'll do my best. But sometimes it's not just about putting people in jail. It's about making sure the bad stuff doesn't happen in the first place." The girl seemed to think about this for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I want to be like you when I grow up." Michelle felt a lump rise in her throat, but she kept her composure. "You can be anything you want to be," she said. "And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The girl beamed and ran off, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. Michelle stood there for a moment, watching her go. The weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but today she had taken a step, a meaningful step, towards something better. And that, she thought, was a victory worth celebrating. As she drove away, the city lights shimmered in the distance, a reminder the work still to be done. But Michelle Carter wasn't afraid of the road ahead. She had faced humiliation, prejudice, and injustice, and she had turned it into something powerful. And she wasn't done yet.